Good evening, everybody. Please take your seats and your cheese. Welcome to our celebration of Seton Hall University, a history, 1856 to 2006. I am Jonathan Farina, Interim Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education and Assessment, and I'm very pleased to be your MC for this evening. I'm also very pleased to have begun work at Seton Hall in 2009, safely outside of the scope of Dr. Quinn's book. Tonight's event has been in the making for 167 years, since Dr. Quinn finished college. Since Seton Hall was founded in 1856. And Dr. Quinn's book is the first and only scholarly history of Seton Hall. We are here thanks to the vision and dedication of two pillars of Seton Hall, President Emeritus Monsignor Robert Sheeran and Professor Dermot Quinn himself. Monsignor Sheeran saw the value in preserving and disseminating Seton Hall's story for future generations and commissioned the work. Professor Quinn possessed the skill, dedication, patience, and good humor, I should add, to research and write a first-rate history worthy of Seton Hall, a story spanning its first 150 years. Those of you who know Dr. Quinn know that you are in for a treat. Even in his conversation and in his emails, Dermot speaks with delightful wit and eccentric learning. Whenever he talks about what he's reading, I'm like, it's not going to be written this century. Which pleases me. His history of Seton Hall shares this balance, beautifully smooth sentences that blend respect and appreciation for the institution with an enjoyable measure of skepticism, humor, and human detail. It tells of well-meaning administrators who regret when their rules do not work, and of the sarcastic Setonian articles that mock them. My favorite article jests about a mandatory rule on shaving every day, which would not work for me, needless to say. Dr. Quinn presents a complex but real Seton Hall, with its tensions and triumphs intact, but with all the personalities and commitments and transformative power that make it so lovable and beloved a university. I'd like to invite now my good friend, Father Colin Kay, Vice President for Mission and Ministry, to offer our invocation.
Thanks, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everybody. Like his Lord Jesus at that wedding feast at Cana, Dermot Quinn saved the best for last. One poor priest's opinion. Just before the appendices, page 451, the last paragraph. Dermot speaks a little bit about what's changed and how much has stayed the same at Seton Hall, and speaks of Bishop Bailey and would he be able to recognize the place. And then the last sentence of that last paragraph, Professor Quinn speaks of the university's moral and intellectual vision, its social and economic purpose, and this is the best part, I think, its openness to the Word, capital W, and the world. Join me, please, in a moment of quiet and still openness as your heads and hearts allow. Almighty One, to the Word, to its life and power, open us. To the world, to all its cares and concerns, open us. to the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of all, especially of those who are poor or in any way afflicted. Open us to your word and to your world, like Bishop Bailey wanted. Open us. With his aunt and with our mother, Elizabeth Bailey Seton, we pray in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen? Amen? Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Father Colin. Our president, Josephine Nair, is traveling on behalf of the university, but he has made a movie for us to wish Dermot well.
Welcome to our discussion of Seton Hall University, a history. I regret that I can't be with you, as I'm certain tonight will be engaging, insightful, and inspirational. The story of our university is one for the ages. It overflows with grit and determination, prayer and learning, hopes realized, and goals achieved. The history of Seton Hall is also a microcosm of other larger stories. Our success mirrors the success of American Catholicism, and indeed America itself. Bishop James Roosevelt Bailey arrived in Newark during an age of immigration. He served a church of outsiders in a society that was indifferent at best and hostile at worst. In this context, he knew that education was the key to joining, then leading, the American mainstream. Soon Seton Hall opened its doors. Year after year, successes came, as did many challenges. But our roots were strong, and our achievements were undeniable. As the book makes clear, we have been united by shared dreams, mission, and goals since the very beginning. Providing a foremost Catholic higher education to deserving students, especially first-generation students and those from modest means. Fostering strong participants in society who lead as servants first, and guiding students to greater faith and wisdom in the Catholic intellectual tradition. These are intentional threads in our history, and they're brought to life every day in transformative new ways. Our strategy and community enable us to make great strides for Seton Hall. We enroll class after class of outstanding freshmen in a very tough admissions landscape. Scholarship support for students is at an all-time high, and so is fundraising. Our faculty are tremendous. We are elevating our spaces and places, with the University Center leading the way. New occasions to deepen faith, service, and our leadership are advancing our reputation. And of course, we host eminent speakers, scholars, and men and women religious from around the world. Now we have a volume that captures nearly all of it. In reading Professor Quinn's work, I recalled a line from Don Quixote. History is the rival of time. Ideas, events, and lives that go unrecorded will be inaccessible to future generations. Simply said, time is the enemy of history. But thanks to Professor Quinn and Monsignor Sharon, the Seton Hall story will never be lost to history. Rather, we have a book that is engaging, wise, insightful, and faithful. A product of history that looks always towards a bright future, just like our university. So thank you. Thank you for all you do. Have a wonderful evening. God bless you, and go Pirates.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Monsignor Robert Sheeran, President Emeritus of Seton Hall. Monsignor's 60-year relationship with the Setonian community has enriched countless lives. His story began at Seton Hall when he arrived as a freshman in 1963. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in classical languages, Monsignor went on to study in Rome and was ordained in 1970. He earned 2 theology degrees and then returned to Seton Hall in 1980, beginning service to the university in various roles. Monsignor Sheeran's presidency began in 1995 and lasted for 15 years, the second longest tenure in university history. He led Seton Hall's transformation from a respectable regional Catholic university to a premier institution of Catholic higher education with a national and international scope. Upon leaving the university in 2010, he was immediately named President Emeritus. It is my great pleasure to welcome him back to campus. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Monsignor Robert Sheeran.
We'll have to check sometime my senior meeting. We both have 15 years. I think he has like 16 days over me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you all. It's a very special evening and a culmination of many years of hard work, and we rejoice together. How did this all come about? When I first began to get involved in administration, I've always been interested in history, but as I interacted with people from different colleges and universities, I was interested in their histories. Every college has a particular culture, a particular campus and architecture, and so forth. And I was interested in histories, began to be interested in college, university histories. And there are all sorts of them. Oxford University, Professor Quinn's alma mater, has a 9-volume history. But then again, if you're 900 years old, you need 9 volumes. And Harvard, of course, had Samuel Eliot Morrison's wonderful history in the mid-1930s, celebrating their 300th anniversary. But all great universities have gradually put together really significant histories. Early in my presidency, I realized that there were 2 events that were about to happen that were important for me in my presidency. Number one was the centennial in 2006, 150 years, and a significant date. And the other one was, in the year 2006, we would be just beginning into the second or third year of a capital campaign, also $150 million. So I figured $150 million and a history of 150 years would make a very nice marriage together. You know, and I felt also Seton Hall deserved a serious history. There are 2 kinds of histories in universities out there. There's the self-congratulatory, self-promoting type, and they're not bad necessarily. They all look very nice on your coffee table, and you send that to alumni. But there's another type of history that is scholarly, and it's ambitious, and it looks at everything in the story. And that's what Professor Quinn and I wanted for Seton Hall. Seton Hall had 2 earlier histories, one in 1931 for its 50th anniversary, and one in 1956 for its 100th. And they were slim, not bad, but they looked beautiful on the coffee table. We needed something significant that represented where Seton Hall was in the mid-90s and what we were becoming as well. Who was going to write it? Well, for me, there was very little question about that. It was Dermot Quinn. I found him always one of our very best and most eloquent writers here on campus, and we have a lot of good writers, but very few of the caliber of Dermot Quinn. And also, he was a very gifted historian as well. His doctoral dissertation, at least his first book, on Catholicism and politics in Victorian England was masterful. So I had asked Dermot if he would write it, and he reminded me recently that it was in Ireland that with Monsignor Cusack and his institute that I had asked him. We both remember Monsignor Cusack. He was just an Old Testament figure, as Dermot refers in the book, but he was the most ferociously dangerous driver I have ever been with in my life. And Dermot and I would be in the car with rosaries begging for him to drive. These are little side roads in Ireland. But at any rate, it was at that time that Dermot agreed to write the history of the university. I met Dermot, I think, Dermot came here, I think, in 1990 from Amherst College. And I was giving a talk maybe in the early 90s. I think it might have been at a faculty luncheon on Mother Seton. Not a scholarly, but a nice little talk about the history of this remarkable woman after whom this community is named. And in the question and answer period, Dermot picked up a white paper cup and with a pirate, a Seton Hall pirate, the old pirate, the pirate with the knife in its mouth. I got rid of that guy within my first year, and now we have a very attractive, enduring pirate. And he lifted it up and he said, "Monsignor, what would Mother Seton say about this?" And I realized he had a great sense of Irish humor and a great sense of irony, and both of them would play out in wonderful ways in this particular history of Seton Hall. "Yes," he said, "I will do it. I want it to be a comprehensive history of the university. I want unfettered access to all sources, and I want to be honest with warts and all." Well, I was a new president at the time, and I was off to a good start. We took off nicely, but with warts and all, it looked a little risky for me because I knew enough about Seton Hall history to know that many presidencies took off very nicely and did not end so nicely. But I said, "Yes, Dermot, go ahead." And I did not know what was before me at the time that Dermot would be writing about. Professor Dermot Quinn is extraordinarily adept at many things, but especially in my view in this book and in his earlier writings, of taking a bunch of disparate facts and various experiences, some soft, some hard, and putting them together, creating from them a believable and richly textured narrative that gives you the story at all levels, not only at the highest level, but the level of the students and so forth, richly textured. And this is what we have in this history of Seton Hall University. In the back of the book, take a look at the resources, the sources he uses to write this. How you ever did this in less than 100 years, Dermot, I do not know. Seton Hall's story, Seton Hall's unique story, is the story of American higher education in miniature, to be sure. And Seton Hall's unique story is also the story of the Catholic Church in the United States, in miniature. It's the story of gains and losses, triumphs and challenges. As I go through the book, a constant theme is financial difficulties. They happen all the time, lots of them. And then there were fires, and tragically, too many of them. There were external forces which shaped us, not only the internal forces, but external forces as well. Depressions, Civil War, First World War, Second World War, GI Bill, which transformed Seton Hall University. And then there was town gown issues, something I never knew before. We had an issue with South Orange that went to the United States Supreme Court. Read that story in the book. But ultimately, the story of Seton Hall is a story of growth and development and success, in my view, from strength to strength, notwithstanding all the issues around it. In the very first page, I believe the first paragraph of the book, Dermot says, Seton Hall was started as an act of faith, in various senses of that word. It was started with faith in God and the incarnated God, Jesus Christ, who became flesh and took our human creation upon himself. And then at the very end, said, "Go forth and teach all nations. Roll up your sleeves. It's an incarnational church. Wherever life is, wherever the gospel needs to be preached, you will be there." And the church was there, generation after generation, century after century, from one culture to another culture, to that summer of 1856, when Bishop Bailey staked out terrain in the acreage of American higher education to do the work of God. That acreage is vastly different today, but as Colin has just said, Bishop Bailey would recognize this institution. What strikes me too, because of the faith that motivated this this drama. Mother Seton's grandson, by the way, as an aside, in the book, her grandson was not as religious as Mother Seton, came and spent some time on campus, and he called it a social comedy. Many things do not change. But it strikes me that the faith gave a resilience to the institution and a resilience to those who played a role here on every level, presidents, professors, students. There was a resilience to the Seton Hall family that I find utterly remarkable. Professor Quinn, thank you for this masterful history. It is an extraordinary labor of love. You tell an eloquent story, an enjoyable story, and an inspiring story, and links us to our rich traditions and enduring legacy. When I finished the book, I realized, those of you that received memos or emails from me in my presidency, I often would end with hazards yet forward. I understood hazard yet forward. It was the motto, an ancient motto of the Seton, Scottish Seton family. In spite of the hazards, move ahead. And that actually is an exquisite motto for what the experience of this community has been. Hazard, step forward, and we move forward boldly and faithfully. And for this wonderful 473-page saga, Seton Hall thanks you, Professor Dermot Quinn, and perhaps no one more than myself. Thank you.
In case the next historian is in the audience, just a very quick introduction of the bio of Dr. Quinn. So, born in Ireland, Professor Quinn was educated at Trinity College in Dublin and New College at Oxford, where he earned his PhD. He taught at Oxford, and as Monsignor Sheeran said, had a fellowship at Amherst College after that. At Seton Hall, he is Professor of History and Director of Graduate Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences. He is also a professor in the Honors Program. Professor Quinn is editor of the Chesterton Review and author of numerous articles on Christopher Dawson and G.K. Chesterton's social thinking. Witness the banner. His books include Understanding Northern Ireland, Patronage and Piety, English Roman Catholics and Politics, 1850 to 1900, and The Irish in New Jersey, 4 Centuries of American Life. Reviews of this book, Seton Hall History, have been overwhelmingly positive. Terry Galway called it an insightful piece of cultural history, and added, the scholarship is profound. Benedictine Abbot Augustine Curley said Quinn definitely tells the story of Seton Hall, which mirrors that of the Catholic Church in New Jersey, and indeed in the nation. We are grateful to have Dr. Quinn here tonight with us. Give it up for Dermot.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. Jonathan, a few years ago, wrote a remarkable book called Everyday Words. And let me use an everyday word, and that is thanks. Thanks to Jonathan for his very kind words of introduction. Thanks to Father Colin for his beautiful prayer. Thanks to Monsignor for his extravagant, in fact, ridiculously extravagant words of praise. One small word of correction. He thanked me for the 473 words of the book. It's actually 558 558 pages, as I just checked on the way up. But I won't hold that against. And thanks also to Dr. Nair for his message. Just a couple of other little acknowledgements. Organizing this event has not been easy. It's a complicated business to put together an event of this size and scope and scale. And I would like to thank In particular, Kirsten Schultz and Anne Giblin-Gedacht and my colleague Gloria Grabois and Pegeen Hopkins and Olivia Lassen and Michael Hyland for organizing, reorganizing, and then organizing again the event. And what we have this evening is the result of their great, indefatigable effort. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the history department for coming along and over the years keeping me on the intellectual straight and narrow. It hasn't been easy for them, but I think they've done their best to keep me on the straight and narrow. So whatever merits this book may have owes certainly something to the ever probing and intelligent questions that my colleagues have asked me. So I'm delighted to say a few words about this book and its winding path to publication. Seton Hall has had a very long history, and this volume, in its small way, is part of it, maybe even a microcosm of a larger story. Everything that the book chronicles, success, failure, getting it right, getting it wrong, could be said of the book itself. It began in the most casual way imaginable when my colleague Ed Shapiro suggested my name to Monsignor Sheeran as a possible author of it, a suggestion that took place, as with so many things at Seton Hall, at a basketball game. So if I sign your copy of it this evening, it is literally a pirated edition. On the strength of that conversation, I was summoned to President's Hall, and half an hour and a certain amount of presidential charm later, I signed away the next 25 years of my life. You have to be careful of what you say in that building. All I stipulated, as if I were in any position to do any stipulating, was that I be allowed, as Monsignor said, to tell the story warts and all, a request to which Monsignor Sheeran readily agreed, possibly looking forward to reading some of those warts himself. All he stipulated was that the book be written by 2006, to which I readily agreed, tripping over the steps in my eagerness to meet the deadline. If one good thing has come of this book, it is that I have never since refused a student who has asked for an extension. What Monsignor Sheeran may not have realized, and what I did not have the courage to tell him, is that giving an historian free run of an archive spanning 150 years is giving a dipsomaniac the keys to the drinks cabinet. There is no guarantee that you'll ever get them back, and no telling what state the historian will be in when you do. In fact, Seton Hall has two magnificent archives, its own and those of the Archdiocese of Newark, and has had some magnificent archivists in charge of them. For many years, Monsignor Bill Field and Dr. Joe Mahoney squirreled away boxes of files and documents in the basement of Duffy Hall, where the idea of temperature control was to find a window and try to open it. Subsequently, Monsignor Frank Seymour was in charge, a man with a prodigious, not to say freakish, memory of the clerical history of the Archdiocese of Newark. Drawing on the wisdom of these men was a great help in writing this book. In fact, knowing them was a kind of prediction of the book itself. Seton Hall has a gift, amounting at times to genius, for bringing together people of strikingly different personalities and requiring them to work for the common good. Sometimes the results are miraculous, sometimes disastrous. Monsignor Field and Dr. Mahoney were such a pairing in the tradition that goes back all the way to Bishop Bailey and Father McQuaid, who founded this place in 1856. If Seton Hall, I think, were ever on late-night television, it would probably be a mixture of Friends, Cheers, and The Odd Couple. At any rate, thanks to the work of these superb archivists, among whom must also be included Alan Delosier and Kate Dodds, I was able to piece together a rich and complex story. In fact, I was able to piece together several stories, and the result is this book. The history of, here we are. The history of an institution is, at one level, simple and self-contained. How did it get from there to here? And the there, in Seton Hall's case, was extremely small, as you can see. An opening class of 5 students in a former seminary for young ladies in Madison in 1856. Whether Bailey ever said that he wanted Seton Hall to be a home for the mind, the heart, and the spirit, he believed that without schools and colleges, the social prospects of New Jersey Catholics were negligible. In that belief, he was vindicated many times over by the school that he founded. So, one of the themes of the book is institutional growth from modest beginnings to current grandeur. For the first 50 years of its existence, so here is Seton Hall in 1856, here is Seton Hall in 1866. For the first years of its existence, Seton Hall was a very small operation. For all practical purposes, a seminary, a college, a chapel, a washhouse, and an infirmary. The duties of its first president, Father Bernard McQuaid, were extremely multifarious, from cultivating parents, to courting donors, to paying bills, to teaching pupils, to hiring faculty, to keeping the faculty well behaved, to running a farm, which gave him more pleasure than the rest combined. The farm was to enable what we nowadays call gourmet dining, of which there was very little at Seton Hall when it moved to South Orange in 1861 and for many years afterwards. Parents sometimes noticed the emaciated state of their sons when they returned home at the end of the academic year. But McQuaid, the farmer, was undaunted. Look closely at the early financial ledgers, and you will find invoices not only for desks and chalk, but also for Epsom salts for cattle. College presidents, you might think, have to deal with enough manure without having to encourage any more of it. Seton Hall in those days was mostly open grassland. President's Hall, now a place of reverential decorum, had classrooms, dormitories, noise, kitchens, and mice. Next to it was the college building, where, when total enrollment reached 100, the boys got a half-day holiday to celebrate. When enrollment was low, costs could be cut by reducing salaries, the financial equivalent of splitting the atom. Weekly examination marks were read to the entire school in those palmy days before anyone had ever heard of data protection. Parents could pay for music lessons for their sons because Seton Hall boasted not only a professor of piano, but a professor of banjo. The debating society allowed opinionated students to express the opinions of their teachers, a practice that has continued ever since. Students were not allowed to smoke, receive newspapers, leave the grounds, or have books of their own. The president reserved the right to censor their letters home, which in the circumstances is unsurprising. No student of low and vicious habits, said the catalogue of 1864, would be admitted to the school. A person of such habits would probably run a mile from it. Well, in such an academic village, everyone knew everybody else's business, sometimes literally so, when parents, or indeed the college itself, struggled to pay the bills. The usual tensions of community life resolved themselves in the usual ways. Some of the faculty took to drink, all of them to gossip. Some students also drank. The future actor John Barrymore, for example, was caught with a half-pint of cheap whiskey in his pocket. Mostly, though, students were worked so hard that they had little energy left over for much in the way of hijinks. The answer to most moral problems was exhaustion. Seton Hall had its critics and its defenders. Some people loved it. Some people did not. Many of the critics were those who loved it most, frustrated, in other words, that those in charge did not see the institution the way they did. No one was ever neutral about it. That passionate commitment was never more obvious during times of peril. In 1866, after a mere 10 years of life, Seton Hall might have closed down when, catastrophically, it burned to the ground. The cause was probably a casually discarded match, a fairly obvious reason for banning smoking. In 1886, it burned down again as a result of a faulty flue in a dormitory. In 1909, it suffered a third fire, which destroyed the college building and threatened the adjacent library in Marshall Hall. The first, and here we are, this is the first fire, and I discovered, to my surprise and delight, that this was actually recorded and noticed in a newspaper, a number of newspapers in Ireland. So this is the Newry Examiner for the 17th of February 1866. And you can see that the Catholic college and seminary known as Seton Hall, situated in South Orange, New Jersey, was almost entirely destroyed by fire on the morning of Sunday last. And here's a word choice which delights me. Fortunately, no accident to life or limb resulted, though the inmates were all in bed when the conflagration broke out. A particularly well-chosen word, I think, and plus ça change. And the building, which was white marble, was a most elegant and commodious one, and you can read the sad details thereafter. So the first and third of these fires produced in response the buildings we now call President's Hall and Mooney Hall. And I just want to pay a little tribute to an unrecognized figure in Seton Hall's history, or an under-recognized figure in Seton Hall's history, and that is this man, Jeremiah O'Rourke. Jeremiah O'Rourke was a Dubliner, and he came to this country at the age of 20. And O'Rourke is a man who left a great stamp on Seton Hall, the designer, the architect of the chapel, and the architect of President's Hall, the architect also of Marshall Hall. And he left his stamp as a Gothic revivalist throughout New Jersey and indeed the rest of the country. He went on to become the supervising architect of the U.S. Capitol. So a little tribute to Jeremiah O'Rourke. Seton Hall survived these disasters because people wanted it to survive. It provided an excellent education at a reasonable price, while forming students morally and spiritually in ways that met with parental approval. So here is really Jeremiah O'Rourke's wonderful legacy to Seton Hall. We have had pleasant letters from the boys every week, wrote a parent. It shows that they have been wonderfully well cared for at the college. So at the moment of its greatest need, Seton Hall was able to draw on large reservoirs of support and affection. There are also periodic attempts to sell the college or to transform it. At one point, it might have been sold to the Christian Brothers. At another, it might have gone to the Benedictines. At one time, it was in the running to become a site for the Catholic University of America. Nothing came of these efforts, but they showed at the minimum that Seton Hall was a force in American Catholic higher education. It is also in some ways becalmed. At the turn of the century, it was still doing well. It was still doing well, but it had always done. But there was a sense that it could be doing more. So here are just a few pictures of the early years of Seton Hall. And here I should once again acknowledge and recognize Bishop Bailey to the left, Bishop Father Bernard McQuaid, subsequently Bishop Bernard McQuaid, Bishop of Rochester, and on the right hand side Michael Corrigan, subsequently Bishop of Newark and Archbishop of New York. So in some ways it was becalmed. At the turn of the century, it was still doing well what it had always done, but there was also a sense that it could be doing more. So here are some of the images of early Seton Hall. This is Alumni Hall, now the chapel of the seminary. And here are the military cadets. Military science started at Seton Hall in 1893. Here is the Glee Club of 1900. So it could be doing more. Here are two of the presidents, President Marshall and James Mooney. 25 years ago, or I may say 15 years ago, Father John Stafford, President Stafford, I don't have a picture of him, wrote in 1905, Seton Hall was as good in material equipment and educational appliances as the average Catholic college. But we cannot make the same boast today. So the school was losing its competitive edge. A graduate, this is Father Stafford again, a graduate of our classical department who proposes to take up the study of medicine is handicapped at the very threshold of his professional studies by his elementary knowledge of chemistry. Students interested in commercial subjects were unprepared for the real world of business. And the same might be said of Seton Hall itself, whose bookkeeping, according to Stafford, was almost as mysterious as the Holy Trinity. I'm not sure if it has become any clearer since. Stafford's successor as president, Monsignor James Mooney, whom you see here on the right, Stafford's successor as president was too remote and inner-directed to bother much with accountancy, as Monsignor Sheeran said. He was more interested in taking cases to the Supreme Court of the United States and losing. So, in its first 50 or 60 years, Seton Hall survived, flourished, established an enviable reputation, and then, ever so slightly, began to fade. It was not quite as good as it claimed to be. By the 1920s, however, it entered the second phase of its institutional history. Thanks to another of those inspired pairings, Bishop John O'Connor and Monsignor Thomas McLaughlin. McLaughlin was a larger-than-life figure with an Irish name and a German nickname, Schlitz, who, for all his undoubted eccentricity, rescued Seton Hall from mediocrity. It was he who discovered not only the importance but the urgency of academic accreditation, something that never occurred to his predecessor. Seton Hall might think the world of its own degrees, but the world didn't think the world of its degrees. McLaughlin realized, somewhat reluctantly, that this needed to change. Otherwise, students would simply go elsewhere. Thanks to him, Seton Hall became a member of the Middle States Association, perhaps his most significant legacy. Thanks also to him, Immaculate Conception Seminary moved from South Orange to Darlington, allowing the college to expand physically and financially. For a while, McLaughlin was both rector of the seminary and president of the college, apparently writing letters to himself in each capacity. A clear case of schizophrenia. He went on to become Bishop of Paterson, where stories are still told about him even to this day. The institutional story developed spectacularly under McLaughlin's next but one successor, Monsignor James Kelly. At the age of 34, Monsignor Kelly became the youngest college president in the country in 1936, a dynamo of self-promotion and genuine creative energy. Under him, Seton Hall opened satellite campuses in Newark and Jersey City, becoming a much more urban and vocational institution and a far better reflection of the changing social realities of the mid-20th century, New Jersey. The College of Nursing, the School of Business, the College of Education and Human Services, all owe their remote origins to Kelly. Those satellite operations, they could hardly be called campuses, were conceived without much planning, in fact, with almost no planning at all. Classes opened somewhat farcically in St. Patrick's Pro-Cathedral in Newark in February 1937, when students discovered that they were supposed to sit at grammar school desks. Still, Kelly persevered, convinced that Seton Hall had to cater much more proactively to future teachers, nurses, and businessmen. He was a visionary leader. Seton Hall's third phase of growth dates from the period after the Second World War, under Kelly and his successor, Monsignor John McNulty. For all practical purposes, Seton Hall reinvented itself after 1945, becoming quite unrecognizable from the college it had been 10 years before. Thanks to Kelly, and as Monsignor Sheeran says, the GI Bill, student numbers, once in the hundreds, were now in the thousands. South Orange became a noisier, raucous, less sedate place. I have a picture of that in a moment. South Orange became a noisier, raucous, less sedate place, although still an all-male preserve. A mixture of boarders and commuters, veterans and teenagers, the married and the single. It engaged in a great experiment in social mobility in the years after the war, an experiment in which the entire country was involved. Kelly seized the moment and never looked back. In a way, that experiment did not end well for Kelly himself, but his successor, Monsignor McNulty, was no less innovative. Under McNulty, Seton Hall acquired a law school, and here is its first dean, Miriam Rooney, It acquired a law school and a medical school, a satellite campus in Paterson, a number of important institutes, and many, many more students. It also became a university. McNulty was an odd mixture of the prodigal and the parsimonious. The law school, and especially the medical school, cost large amounts of money that Seton Hall struggled to find. Meantime, he engaged in feats of personal frugality, which were themselves almost extravagant. He once complained that a philosophy professor had bought a car with Seton Hall's money, namely his own salary. He reduced the amount of fruit served in the priest's dining room by insisting that apples don't grow on trees, you know. He was a memorable man. McNulty died unexpectedly in 1959 and was succeeded as president by Bishop John J. Doherty. And here is undergraduate life in 1951. And here is some more undergraduate life in 1951. And that kind of tension between this and that kind of sums up a good deal of Seton Hall in the 1950s. McNulty died unexpectedly in 1959 and was succeeded as president by Bishop John J. Doherty. Here is the annual retreat of 1950. So this is pretty much undergraduate life, a mixture of this, and this. McNulty died unexpectedly in 1959 and was succeeded as president by Bishop John J. Doherty, who inaugurated the fourth phase of Seton Hall's growth. Doherty was eloquent, where McNulty was gruff, but they were cut from the same Irish Catholic cloth. Both of them rode a wave of educational and social transformation that neither of them, I think, fully understood. Doherty was ably assisted by, and here we are, by Father Tom Fay. You can see on the left-hand side, Father Albert Hakem, whom many of you may remember as Dr. Hakem, but he was formerly Father Hakem, and Edward Fleming, among others, as he transformed the university academically and physically, bringing a greater professionalism to academic appointments, promotions, overseeing the creation of new departments, changing the appearance of the campus, closing the Newark operation, transferring the medical and dental school to the state, making South Orange co-educational, giving the faculty a greater say in university governance, encouraging the arts, promoting the humanities, establishing an honours programme, and in general, making sure that Seton Hall was part of that quest for excellence in which every Catholic college seemed to be engaged in the 1960s. So some of those changes. Here is the faculty. In 1967, only one woman, as you can see, and that is Chris Greco, whom some of you may remember, and indeed remember very, very fondly indeed. And here are the other members of the faculty. The gentleman on the top right-hand corner is George Devine, and I believe his nickname was Boomer Devine. And I think if that's true, I can kind of just more or less work out from that photograph that he was well named. The faculty became a little more assertive in the late 1960s and early 70s, and here is a picture of the Faculty Senate in 1972. You may recognize here, bearded like the pard, Professor John Sweeney, a younger Professor Sweeney, and various other people. And just to give you an idea of how extremely assertive the faculty became, here is Professor James McGlone, And I propose to enter this photograph in a caption competition, and I will a free copy of the Seton Hall history for anyone who can come up with the caption for this. But this is Dr. McGlone as a tribune of the people in mid oration. So in other words, about an hour into the meeting, and beside him is the late Professor Tom Duff, and I think the caption would certainly be a thought bubble coming from Professor Duff's head, but I look forward to the entries to that caption competition. So Bishop Doherty presided over a transformed and transformative university. And it was part of that, as I say, quest for excellence that was a hallmark of Catholic colleges in the 1960s. At the same time, he faced enormous political and cultural challenges in the form of the Vietnam War, the Second Vatican Council, the Civil Rights Movement, and locally, the racial tensions that exploded in Newark in 1967. When he relinquished the presidency in 1969, Seton Hall was a very different institution from 1960 or 1950, and certainly from the Seton Hall that he joined as a freshman in 1926. So, McNulty for the 1950s, Doherty for the 1960s. But of course, the past does not shape itself neatly into 10-year periods as in some high school textbook. Still, it is tempting to see the 1970s as the fifth phase of Seton Hall's institutional history, a time of retrenchment, and the 1980s as the sixth phase, a time of renewed growth. Retrenchment is a euphemism for severe financial distress. Renewed growth is a catch-all term for a massive building program and the return of Immaculate Conception Seminary to the South Orange campus in 1985. I see Professor John Shannon here, who is very much involved in rescuing Seton Hall from the exigencies of the late 1970s. So those of us who have a job here have a lot to thank Professor Shannon for. In the 1980s, there was talk of a Seton Hall Renaissance, which may not be wide of the mark, given that what preceded it was near death. It was certainly another time of profound institutional transformation. Approaching the millennium, the story continued to be one of financial consolidation, academic improvement, curricular development, and occasional public controversy. The first three of these had longer-term significance than the fourth. At the time, of course, it was the controversies that seemed to matter most. Obviously, the greatest institutional transformation came with coeducation in the late 1960s. The final stage of the story is no less dramatic than the stages that preceded it. Under Monsignor Robert Sheeran, Seton Hall saw important long-term institutional developments, among them the implementation of a university core curriculum, the establishment of a school of diplomacy, the move to flat-rate tuition, growing internationalization, the creation of a Centre for Catholic Studies, the renewed emphasis on the beauty of the campus, and of course, the use of computers at all hours of the day and night. Probably the most significant of all his achievements is to bring the Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture to Seton Hall. There was also a major capital campaign. Not the least of his legacies has been the magnificent renovation of the University Chapel. I think Jeremiah O'Rourke would be proud of him. So such, in baldest summary, is the story of this book. But it is not the only story of this book. Or, more precisely, it is not the only way to think of the story. For the reality is that the history of Seton Hall is also the history of everything else. So many different worlds have met in this one place. So many different histories have revealed themselves in the singular history of Seton Hall. This place often thinks of itself as exceptional, and in some ways it is. But its historical importance is precisely and paradoxically that it is not. Nothing happened here that did not also happen somewhere else. Seton Hall is the echo and the example of wider, deeper, richer worlds. If you want to know the history of New Jersey, start here. If you want to know the history of immigration and assimilation, start here. If you want to know the history of urbanization and suburbanization, start here. If you want to know the history of secondary and higher education, start here. If you want to know the history of the professions, start here. If you want to know the history of race or class or gender in America, start here. Above all, if you want to know the history of the Catholic Church in America, start here. Because all of these things, for better or worse, are to be found in that institution. Seton Hall, to quote a well-known New Jersey poet, contains multitudes. I hope this book, in its own small way, captures some of that multitudinousness. So that's the story, warts and all. Seton Hall has made mistakes over the years, but a century and a half after its founding, it is still here. This book has a few mistakes too. I noticed a couple of them already, and Peter R. noticed a third, and I noticed yet another this afternoon. So this book has made a few mistakes, but I hope that the first 30 people who have signed for this event don't demand their money back. But my mistakes notwithstanding, I'm glad that Monsignor Sheeran and Dr. Shapiro had that conversation all those years ago, because this is an extremely interesting place, and it has been extremely interesting to write about it. If I'm ever asked to do it again, I promise to be a bit quicker the next time. So thank you all very, very much.
We have a few moments if anyone would like to ask a question or two of Dermot in front of the crowd. Otherwise, we have refreshments in the back and the conversation will continue. All right. Well, thank you very much, Dermot, and please enjoy the refreshments and keep talking.